do want to welcome everyone this morning. We appreciate you being here. Okay. At least you're able to get it, Howard, and that way I can still see it, so that's the main thing. I hope that everyone had a very profitable week, and know that I did, and if I can get a little bit more work done, it'll even be better. Last week, when we ended our study in Joshua, we were talking about AI, and we had gotten down into verses 14 through 29. And before we really start back with that, I'll mention that next week I will not be here. I will be speaking at a lectureship in Calhoun, Georgia. And so the files will be encoded and will still be shown, so they will still be available, but I might even be able to drop by for a few minutes in the chat room, but otherwise won't be able to be here in person. As I mentioned there, we were in discussing about how AI is going to be captured and destroyed from Joshua the 8th chapter. When Israel finally, after laying all the plans and getting prepared, and if you remember the files of these maps that I sent you, the GIF files, if you pull up number 3, that gives you a good picture as to what's taking place here. And of course the RTF file that goes with number 3 explaining what the numbers are. And I know that there are some individuals who do not have access to the chat room, and those individuals, if who might be watching and viewing these files, if you want to email me and have me email you these files, then that will be fine. I can do that also, so that you can keep up with these things. But would encourage you to kind of be watching the maps as we go through here, and they do give a little bit of view as to what is taking place. But the trap is now laid, and now then the children of Israel come out, and the king of Ai sees them, so he hurriedly gets all of his men to fight against them, and then Israel pulls back as they had before, like they were going to retreat. And when they do, the men that were lying in wait now come, and they're going to attack the city. And that's where we are in verse 19 when we ended last time. It says, and the ambush arose quickly out of their place, and they ran as soon as he had stretched out his hand, and they entered into the city and took it, and hasted and set the city on fire. So here they are. They attacked the city. These men that had been laying in ambush enter the city, and of course all the soldiers had left the city and left it unprotected. And so here they are able to enter the city without much difficulty, and then they set the city on fire. Verse 20 states that the men of Ai looked behind them. They saw, and behold, the smoke of the city ascended up to heaven, and they had no power to flee this way or that way, and the people that fled to the wilderness turned back upon their pursuers. So here the men of Ai looked around after leaving the city and saw their city being burned up. They see the smoke of the city coming up. They realized that there's now no way for them to flee from Israel. They couldn't go any way without, they were surrounded now. And they also start realizing the big mistake that they made. This is a horrible mistake, leaving the protection of the city and allowing Israel to take hold of it, to destroy it, basically. And so they can't go forward, they can't go backwards, they're trapped. There were some who tried to flee to the wilderness, and they turned their back on Israel. Verse 21, then Joshua and all Israel saw that the ambush had taken the city, and that the smoke of the city ascended. Then they turned again and slew the men of Ai. So when Joshua and his men see the smoke of the city, they now turn from their with retreat, and they turn to attack the men of Ai. Then verse 22 adds, and the other issued out of the city against them. So they were in the midst of Israel, some on this side, some on that side. And they smote them so that they let none of them remain or escape. So now then, the men who had taken the city, the 5,000 men, come out, and they trap the men of Ai. And they're surrounded. And so now then Israel destroys them so that no one is left alive. No one escapes. Verse 23, the king of Ai they took alive and brought him to Joshua. So instead of killing the king, they take him alive, they bring him back to Joshua. In verse 24, it came to pass when Israel had made an end of slaying all the inhabitants of Ai in the field, in the wilderness, wherein they chased them, and where they had all fallen on the edge of the sword, until they were consumed, that all the Israelites returned unto Ai and smote it with the edge of the sword. So after killing all of the men of Ai, even the ones who had tried to flee, they then returned to Ai, the city of Ai itself, and they now kill all the people who are left in Ai. Verse 25 tells us, and so it was that all that fell that day, both men and women, were 12,000, even all the men of Ai. So the total number of men of Ai, we now find out, which were killed on that day, was 12,000. Of course, the fighting men of Israel that came up against Ai was a much larger number than the total number of men of Ai. So on this occasion, they didn't have any difficulty in taking the men of Ai and overcoming that situation. Verse 26, for Joshua drew not his hand back, wherewith he stretched out the spear, until he had utterly destroyed all the inhabitants of Ai. So here, as we mentioned last week, as we were reading this, Joshua was going to hold his hand down, and that was the signal for the attack to take place. And he remained that way with his hand out until all of the people of Ai had been destroyed. Verse 27, only the cattle and the spoil of that city Israel took for a prey upon themselves, according unto the word of the Lord, or Jehovah, which he commanded Joshua. So here the cattle of the city were taken by the Israelites, as God had stated to Joshua. And we remember that the spoil of the city of Jericho, they were not allowed to take that. That was something that was dedicated to God. Thus, they were not allowed to take it. It was an accursed thing to them. But now then, God states in relationship to the spoil of the city of Ai, you can have that. You can take that. That's for you. But also notice in this verse, that they did this according unto the word of Jehovah, which he commanded Joshua. Now then, there was a continued obedience to God's command. And if we go back in relationship to what happened with Achan in the previous chapter, and the men of Israel fleeing from Ai, and the reason was sin was in the camp. Now then, in that chapter, the previous chapter, we see Israel taking care of the sin. So they purge the sin from their camp, and now then what happens? They take the city. And we start learning a lesson from this. We talked a lot about last week church discipline and how that God expects proper discipline to take place. Well, here we now learn that proper discipline works. It might not always, and certainly one of the reasons for church discipline, withdrawing fellowship from an individual, is because that to save the soul of that individual, it's an act of love toward that individual. I want him to be saved. That's our desire, for him to be saved in the day of judgment. And to do that, he has to recognize the sin that he is involved in, and he has to come out of that sin. And we need to be encouraging them and talking to them to get them to repent. And now then, when all of those efforts are refused and they don't repent, there comes a time when we withdraw fellowship from that individual, and as a result of that withdrawal of fellowship, then it is for the purpose of making him, in this last-ditch effort, if I can call it that, it's an effort to try and get him to repent, to realize the state that he's in, thus turning him over to Satan. Well, that's one of the purposes, but that's not the only purpose of withdrawal of fellowship. It's also to save the souls of other individuals. It's to save and to retain the purity of the church and to encourage others not to engage in sin. Well, proper discipline works. It might not always lead to the restoration of that individual who was withdrawn from. There's many times that that individual will remain in their rebellion and they will be lost. But still, proper discipline works. Achan was put to death as a result of his sin. But there was sin in the camp, and they had to take care of it properly. When they did, they're now able to take Ai. Until they did that, they could not. And when they took care of it properly, then they took Ai. When the church withdraws fellowship, and I'm talking about sometimes we don't do it properly. So I'm talking about proper church discipline and all that involves. When you do that, success is going to be the result for the church. Even though that one individual might end up being lost, still it's going to bring about success for the church. Well, in verse 28 now, says, "And Joshua burnt Ai and made it a heap forever, even a desolation unto this day." So Joshua burns Ai down to the ground, and when this book was written, and sometimes when we read these things, like even unto this day, we think of our day. And I know when I was very young, I did that many times in relationship to what the Bible says. A lot of times we see it today, especially with premillennialists, as they go over to Matthew the 24th chapter and the things of that day and what Jesus says to the people of that day, they apply to today. Same thing with Mark 9 and verse 1. That's an injustice. It's when this book was written, the city was still desolate. For a minute, turn back to Deuteronomy, the 7th chapter, and let's look at what Moses commanded in relationship to the coming into the land. And that's Deuteronomy 7, and specifically the first 5 verses. It says, "When the Lord thy God shall bring thee into the land whither thou goest to possess it, and hast cast out many nations before thee, the Hittites and the Girgashites and the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, 7 nations greater and mightier than thou. And when the Lord thy God shall deliver them before thee. Now notice what he says in relationship to these nations. 1, thou shalt smite them. 2, and utterly destroy them. 3, thou shalt make no covenant with them, nor for show mercy unto them. 5, neither shalt thou make marriages with them. And in relationship to that, thy daughter thou shalt not give unto his sons, nor his daughter shalt thou take unto thy sons. For it will turn away thy sons from following me, that they may serve other gods. So will the anger of the Lord be kindled against you, and destroy thee suddenly. But this shall ye deal with them. Ye shall, and here again another point, destroy their altars, and next break down their images, and cut down their groves, and another point, burn their graven images with fire. So here's all of these things which Moses commanded Israel to do in relationship to those nations. They were to smite them, utterly destroy them, make no covenant with them, show them no mercy, not intermarry with them, destroy their altars, break down their images, cut down their groves, burn their graven images with fire. So here Joshua is now burning Ai down to the ground, as was instructed. Again, a continued obedience to the commands of God. Verse 29, and the king of Ai he hanged on a tree until eventime. And as soon as the sun was down, Joshua commanded that they should take his carcass down from the tree and cast it at the entering of the gate of the city, and raise their own a great heap of stones that remaineth unto this day. So Joshua takes the king of Ai and hangs him till the sunset. When he takes down the body, it was a possibility that they killed the king prior to his hanging. It could be either way. There's no way to state one way or the other definitely. But they're taking him down at evening would be according to what Moses had written in Deuteronomy 21, verses 22 and 23. It states there, and if any man have committed a sin worthy of death, and he be put to death, thou hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain all night upon the tree, but thou shalt in any wise bury him that day. For he that is hanged is accursed of God, that thy land be not defiled, which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance. So they were not to allow a body to remain hanging on a tree more than that day. They were to take him down at evening, or else the land would be defiled. And so they took the body down and put it at the entering of the gate of Ai. And then they buried it by putting stones on his body to make a great heap, which also remained at the time of the writing of Joshua. This again would be another set of memorial stones to serve as a remembrance of what has happened. Not only have the memorial stones that were just on the west side of the Jordan River, you have the ones that were in the Jordan River. Now then you have this one as well. Now then, in verses 30 through 35, we have Joshua's altar and the renewal of the covenant. Verse 30 states, Then Joshua built an altar unto Jehovah God of Israel in Mount Ebal. So now then, Joshua builds this altar to God on Mount Ebal. Mount Ebal was about 20 to 30 miles north of Ai. Constable writes, and I think it's interesting, the comment that he makes here concerning this altar, that this ceremony establishes Yahweh as the God of Israel, verse 30, in the sight of the Canaanites as well as the Israelites. It amounted to Israel's declaration of dependence. We have our Declaration of Independence, in which we had that declaration of setting forth our independence from England, and as a result, that was saying forth, we are independent of England now. But here is a declaration of dependence, not independence, but dependence, that we are dependent upon God and God's mercy and God's grace in relationship to all of this that is going on and all that we do. Jerry, good to see you finally made it. You can go back and pick up that which we've gone over before already. But here we have a ceremony establishing that here is Israel, and God is our God. And it lets the Canaanites as well as the Israelites themselves know we are dependent upon God. Verse 31, as Moses, the servant of Jehovah, commanded the children of Israel, as it is written in the book of the law of Moses, an altar of whole stones, over which no man hath lifted up any iron, and they offered their own burnt offerings unto Jehovah, and sacrificed peace offerings. So this altar is being built according to the commandment which Moses had given, and which was written in the book of the law. This is probably having reference to the 27th chapter of Deuteronomy. The altar is built by using whole stones, and he describes that whole stones as being stones by which no man had lifted up iron. Or in other words, they had not cut the stones with iron, or broken them, or cut them that way. So they were still intact. After building the altar, they then burnt offerings and peace offerings upon this altar. Verse 32, and he wrote there upon the stones a copy of the law of Moses, which he wrote in the presence of the children of Israel. So now then Joshua takes these stones and he writes a copy of the law of Moses. In all probability, this did not include what we have in Genesis through Deuteronomy. It was not all of that. It was probably just the Decalogue, or the Decalogue is another statement or a comment term for the Ten Commandments, and not the entirety of the law. Some think that instead of it being the Decalogue, that instead it was the blessings and the cursings that were found in Deuteronomy. Whichever, though, he writes this upon these stones and in the presence of all of the children of Israel. Verse 33, he goes on, and all Israel and their elders and officers and their judges stood on this side of the ark and on that side before the priest, the Levites, which bear the ark of the covenant of Jehovah, as well the stranger as he that was born among them, half of them over against Mount Gerizim, and half of them over against Mount Ebal, as Moses, the servant of Jehovah, had commanded before that they should bless the people of Israel. So now then, here's all the Israelites, along with the elders, the officers, and the judges, standing on both sides of the ark. The strangers would be those who were living in Judea that had been circumcised, and thus they could and did partake in the Passover. Later, a stranger was known, and we commonly know him as a proselyte. Half of the people were on Mount Gerizim, the other half on Mount Ebal. The way in which this was set up was almost like an amphitheater, and the altar would have been in the middle of them with the people on both sides. And those who have, and I think Winton in his book that you should be reading, and maybe you've already read this, but he goes into some detail as to, I believe it was J.W. McGarvey, and what his own experiment in getting to that area and speaking that people could hear very easily for a long distance. And that's the way most amphitheaters were. The sound was just almost incredible in that regard, that it would carry a long way without having to yell and scream at the top of your lungs. So a great number of people would be able to hear the blessings and the cursings that are going to be set forth, even though there was a great number of people that would have been there that they all easily could have heard. He then states that they're doing this according to the instructions that Moses had commanded Israel. The purpose of this was to bless the people, and these instructions would have been given in Deuteronomy, the 11th chapter, in verse 29, and then Deuteronomy chapters 27 and 28 in that regard, and specifically the blessings and cursings that are found written there. Verse 34 states that, and afterward he read all the words of the law, the blessings and cursings, according to all that is written in the book of the law. So Joshua read all the words which Moses had written. And in this reading, he read the blessings. The blessings basically, and we can sum it up, when you obey God's law, God is going to bless you. He also reads the cursings, and we can sum up the cursings. When you disobey God, God is going to punish you. And those principles are still true today. When we obey God's law, God will bless us. When we disobey God's law today, God's going to punish us. And notice that he read both aspects of it, the blessings and the cursings, both positive and negative. And I almost hesitate to use the word negative, because I think we in some cases misapply negative and negative preaching. What is really negative preaching? Well, negative preaching is not setting forth, for example, here with Joshua, the cursings. That wasn't negative. That was, in a very real sense, positive. Now, I know that generally the usage of the term negative, the cursings would be negative and the blessings would be positive, but I think we need to rethink that a little bit. This is my own opinion. Any part of God's law is positive. Any part of God's law is positive from the standpoint it is helping me, it is aiding me to get to heaven. Even those things that tell me don't do such and such, don't live this way. Well, that's positive, not negative, because it is telling me, informing me how to get to heaven. Those things that I cannot do so that I can get to heaven. That's positive preaching. That's not negative. Now, yes, I know that it's stating those things we cannot do, and in that sense, the cursings. So, but even if we take today's definitions of the idea of positive and negative preachings, preachers need to learn we must declare all the counsel of God. That's what Acts 20 and verse 27 states, that we must preach and declare the whole counsel of God, not just part of the counsel of God. We've got to be truly balanced, and again, I think a lot of times we see a misuse of this term, balanced preaching. To a lot of people, balanced preaching means you eliminate those, as we would see here, cursings, and just set forth the blessings. Or as the term negative and positive preaching, you eliminate the negative and preach all positive sermons, then that's balanced preaching. Well, no, it's not. Not in truth. We truly need to be balanced. That is a presentation of both positive and negative. And from the standpoint of what we see in regards to preach the word, that command in 2 Timothy 2 and chapter 4 and verse 2. Preach the word, be instant in season, out of season. Notice now, reprove and rebuke. Two things that we would generally refer to as negative, and then exhort. One thing that we would generally refer to as positive preaching. So both of them are important. We cannot eliminate one and then simply do the other. That's not balanced. Joe asked in verse 33, are we saying that Moses had commanded this event? As far as, yes, the situation there and with the altar and half of the people on Mount Gerizim, half of them on Mount Ebal, that Moses had commanded this. Now it was what God had commanded, but he did it through Moses. And we gave some passages along that line. It was the instructions were set forth, Deuteronomy 11 and verse 29, for example, which says, and it shall come to pass when the Lord thy God hath brought thee into the land whither thou goest to possess it, that thou shalt put the blessing upon Mount Gerizim and the curse upon Mount Ebal. Well, this is the fulfillment of thus that which Moses had commanded, yes. Moses did, in that sense, command it. Now, it was instructions that God had given, but yes, it was given through Moses. So now then we see Joshua doing that. Verse 35 now tells us, and there was not a word of all that Moses commanded, which Joshua read not before all the congregation of Israel, with the women and the little ones and the strangers that were conversing among them. So Joshua read all of the law, not just some of it, to all of the people. And just another word in relationship to what we see here. It's interesting, why didn't they say, well, these children can't understand it. Let's take them out and let's have their own assembly for them. They didn't do that. The women, the men, the women, and yes, even the little ones and the strangers, they were all there. They did not, in that sense, divide that assembly. And I would add that we have absolutely no right to divide the worship assembly today either. We just don't have authority for that. We see doesn't matter what excuses people might give in order to try and do this, we do not have that right. Woodstra states in relationship to this that the story of the building of an altar on Mount Ebal and of the solemn reading of the blessings and cursings of the covenant at that site is strategically important for an understanding of the message of the book of Joshua. He goes on to write, in unmistakably clear symbolism, the reader is told that the right to possess the promised land is tied to the proclamation of and subjection to God's covenant claims upon His children and upon the world, or upon His people and upon the world. That God has covenant claims upon them, just like we're going to receive promises of God, but who? Those who are in that covenant relationship with God. God is over all of the world. All people are subject to Him, even though not all people come into that relationship with Him where we are His people and He is our God. And those individuals are going to possess the promised land, not those who rebel against Him. Here, that right is being set forth in relationship to Israel, that they possess the promised land because they are God's people and their obedience to God's law. Now then, chapter 9 is a treaty with the Gibeonites. In the first 2 verses, we see that the kings combine against Israel. It states, "And it came to pass, when all the kings which are on this side of Jordan, in the hills and in the valleys and in the coast of the great sea over against Lebanon, the Hittite and the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite heard thereof." So this side of Jordan refers to the west side between the Mediterranean and the Jordan. The word Canaanite is sometimes used to refer to one tribe in the land of Canaan, as it is here. Sometimes it's used generically for all of the different tribes in Canaan. Jebusites would be those individuals who lived in what we know as Jerusalem. Earlier, it was referred to as Salem. Then, now then, Jebusites, and then later Jerusalem. Verse 2, it says that they gathered themselves together to fight with Joshua and with Israel with one accord. So all these nations form a coalition to fight against Israel. And a lot of times what we see, and I think we mentioned this last week maybe, that people who do not like each other yet will band together or join together to fight against a common enemy. We also, from this, start learning that there is strength in unity. And we see that in opposition to what we would read in Galatians 5 and verse 15. "If ye bite and devour one another, take heed that ye be not consumed one of another." A lot of times what we see in the church today, instead of a unifying force, we are so busy biting and devouring one another that we can't do anything for the Lord. Or we don't do anything for the Lord. Because here we are just fighting and devouring one another, instead of unifying and becoming a unified one and going to battle against Satan and his forces with one accord. There's a great deal that we can learn in relationship to that. I'm not saying in any way, shape, or form that we should compromise the truth, and we'll get into that more as we go through this 9th chapter, but we need to unify our efforts under and by the direction of God's Word, unify our efforts in fighting against Satan. And a lot of times we just don't do that. Instead, we'd rather fight and devour and try and destroy each other. And the liberals and denominational people literally have a heyday at our expense. And they talk about why we can't even get along among ourselves. And it's a charge which we need to pay attention to. And sometimes, yes, I realize that charge is a false charge because they are misrepresenting the facts. We're fighting for truth many times. And when someone goes away from the truth, yes, we can't get along with that individual because he's left the truth. But sometimes it's not the situation where that's the case. Sometimes we're just fighting and devouring each other. Well, they unified. Even though they might not have been friends previous to this time, they now come together to fight against Israel. Verse 3 now, through verse 15, we have the Gibeonites' deception. The Gibeonites' deception. States in verse 3, and when the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done unto Jericho and to Ai. So now then, we see that Israel is still at Gilgal. And Gilgal basically becomes what we're going to see their base of operations for a long period of time, as during this campaign or this war. After hearing what Israel has done to Jericho, and now then after hearing what they've done to Ai, well, now then the Gibeonites are going to devise a plan. Gibeon was about 20 miles west of Gilgal. It was one of the largest towns in the central part of Canaan. It was, we learn, larger than Ai, according to chapter 10 and verse 2. And it was possibly the Hivite capital. It later becomes a Levitical town, according to Leviticus 18 and verse 25 and Leviticus 21. And I said Leviticus, I meant Joshua 18 and 25 and Joshua 21:17. And the Israelites eventually pitched the tabernacle there, where it remained at that site until Solomon built the temple in 1 Chronicles 16:34 or 39. 1 Chronicles 21:29, and 1 Kings 3, verses 4 and 5. Now, in verse 4, it says, they did work wilily, and went and made as it had been ambassadors, and took old sacks upon the asses, and wine bottles, old and rent, and bound up. So they worked in a crafty, deceitful manner. They are doing this very simply to try to figure out a way to escape the destruction that they know is going to come upon them otherwise. Joe makes a good point. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. That old statement, and that's very true, and that's what we see there in the first couple of verses. But here's Gibeon. They're going to act in this crafty, deceitful manner. And again, notice a contrast going back to Rahab. She knows that Israel is going to take the land. She submits to the God of Israel and eventually is found even in the genealogy of our Lord. Here's other nations know that the land has been given to Israel, and what do? Well, they fight against it instead of submitting to the God of Israel. Or, as we see in this case, they're going to act in this deceitful manner instead of submitting to the God of Israel. So, they come to Joshua and Israel at Gilgal as if they had been sent as representatives of someone else. They are making it appear as if everything had been in use for a long period of time. Now in verse 5, and old shoes and clouded upon their feet, and old garments upon them, and all the bread of their provisions was dry and moldy. So they found everything that they could that was old to present themselves as having traveled this long distance. We learn a principle in this, that the way people present themselves is not always an accurate picture. of the situation. They might present themselves in one way, saying, this is the way that we are. And the outward appearance might appear as if, yes, that is the way that they are. But in reality, they're presenting themselves as something which they're not. Remember the statements first in Matthew 7 and verse 15, that we are to beware of wolves in sheep's clothing, or false prophets which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they're ravening wolves, Matthew 7 and verse 15. Or Acts 20 and verse 29, when Paul is talking to these Ephesian elders, and he says, for I know this, that after my departing shall grievous wolves enter in among you, not sparing the flock. Well, are they going to come in with a presentation of, I'm a grievous wolf? Well, no, they're going to come in sheep's clothing. That which is the outward appearance of them is not really what they were. They were something totally different. In 2 Peter 2, it says that there were false prophets also among the people, even as there shall be false teachers among you, who privily shall bring in damnable heresies, even denying the Lord that bought them, and bring upon themselves swift destruction. And it says that many shall follow their pernicious ways. They're not going to come and say, hey, I'm an evil false teacher. That's not the way that they're going to present themselves. They're going to present themselves as this sheep. Someone who's faithful and loving and kind and gentle, and he is faithful to God and loves God so much, but their teaching is damnable heresies. With the end result is that many are going to follow that way, and they're going to be destroyed because they are following the damnable heresies of these individuals. Now then, coming back to Joshua, and we get down to verse 6, and it states, and they went to Joshua unto the camp at Gilgal, and said unto him and to the men of Israel, we be come from a far country. Now therefore make ye a league with us. So they stated outright now, we're from a far country. They had made it appear from everything that they had on and that they had with them that that was the case. They are from a far country. They've made the statement now, we're from a far country. But very simply, they lied. And now then they make the request, make a league or a covenant with them. Well, we should remember, we read it just a moment ago, that Moses had told the people very clearly, do not make a covenant or a league or an agreement with the people of the land. Deuteronomy 7 verses 1 through 4, and especially in verse 2, he states that specifically, do not make a covenant with them. Well, the Gibeonites knew that if they came to Joshua and said, well, we're right over here, we're your next door neighbors now, and we want to make this agreement with you, they knew that Israel would not have been a party to that. They would not have made that agreement, and it would have ended up being that they were going to destroy, that they would have destroyed them. So they make this misrepresentation. We're from a far country, and everything that they had showed that that was to be the case. Well, we're going to stop there now for our break, and we're going to pick up right here after the break.